So this is a new series that I'm starting on deciphering chord charts for worship songs. It's a series I've been wanting to do for a while because chord charts lie all the time, or they're confusing. I see a lot of chord charts from, Song Select, CCLI, online, wherever your church gets chord charts from, and as a bass player, I don't have to worry too much about the chord charts because I'm not worrying about how to voice the chords or anything like that, or finding out if the chords really match with what's really being played. As long as I'm getting the bass notes there, I don't have to worry as much about it. But I do get frustrated watching other musicians that are struggling with trying to play something that sounds correct for the song when they're playing the chart. And while chord charts are great because they give you a good bird's eye view really quickly of a song, but they're also limited on how much information they can provide. On the other hand, sheet music is great because it can provide all those missing details, but it's more work for most musicians to be able to deal with. And unfortunately, most musicians nowadays don't seem to be able to read music, even though it's pretty simple and easy to learn, but that's a whole other topic for another video. So this series is on the secrets to how to fill in the detailed gaps on what most worship chord charts are trying to tell you. The first song that I'm addressing is one that you've probably heard it plenty of times. It's been around for quite a while. It's One Thing Remains, Your Love Never Fails, and likely, unless this is your first time being on a worship team or you're new to a worship team, you probably already know how to play the song. However, this video will at least challenge you on how you're currently playing to see if you're playing it right, and give you some insight on deciphering chord chart secrets, not just for this song, but for other songs that you might be doing. All right, so I'm going to start off, and also I want to mention that I'm going to be doing this song in the key of D, even though I know that the original recording, there's 1,000 different versions of this song, but most of the versions that I hear tend to be in the key of B. Whereas our worship team is playing it in the key of D, so that's why I'm doing it in the key of D. However, everything that I'm playing can be moved to the key of B, no problem, because everything with music is patterns. So if that's a D chord here, if you move it to the key of B, all you're doing is you're just shifting all the notes over. That's all you're doing. So everything you're doing here, you can apply to any other key. All right, so based on that, since we're in the key of D, if we look at the verse chord progression that I have from the chord chart, from what our church gives me from the service that they're hooked up with, this is the chord chart that I get. I get a G major 7 to D to A. That's my chord progression for the verse. So I'm going to play that for you, and I'm going to play it all in root position. So if you're new to playing chords like on a keyboard, and you might say, okay, I learned my G major 7, I learned my D, I learned my A, this might be where you play it when you first start out playing. So you might go, okay, G major 7 to a D to an A. All right. Okay, that kind of sounds a little funny. It works, but it sounds a little funny. One reason is because you're doing big jumps between each chord. You could also go, but you're bouncing around a lot, and that's really inefficient, and it doesn't really lead to good voice leading from one chord to the next. So another way we could do this is we could do it with inversions. We could start off with the same first chord, and then we could do an inversion of the D chord, which instead of doing that, and then that sets us up for the A. Okay, it's a little better, but it's still, something just doesn't quite sound right about it. It sounds a little strange. So I'm going to show you the first secret of deciphering chord charts for contemporary worship music, and that is they use a lot of sus chords. They alternate between a major chord and a sus chord. And in this case, we're in the key of D. It's going to use a D major chord in its root position. We're going to use a sus4 D sus4. We're also going to use a D sus2. And that's all the chords we're going to use. And we're going to play the whole song with just that. How are we going to do that? Because the bass note, this is secret number 2 of chord charts, is that the bass note is going to determine what the chord is. So in this case, I'm going to start off with a D sus4, and I'm going to play a G note, which technically that's, if I took that out of this inversion here, I could say there's the G sus2, but I'm playing it originally as if it's a D sus4, but adding a G to the bass note, and now suddenly it's a G sus2. Okay, cool, so that's our first chord, and that sounds better than, see that? That doesn't sound like the song. That sounds a little bit more like the song there. And then the next chord is going to be D. Okay, that's D, that's what we had before, that's fine. And now for the third chord, we're going to do a sus4, because we're playing a D sus4 here, but when we add the A, now it's a sus4. So we get, that sounds a lot more like the song. Now I know there's a whole bunch of different versions of the song out there, but that sounds a whole lot more like the song than the first thing I played. So I think we're on to something here. All right, so another thing that the sus chords do is it gives you a lot of tension, because sus chords always want to feel like they resolve. Now in this case, this chord right here seems like it wants to go, that feels, it's resolved, it feels better now. But if you're always resolving the chord, then there's no tension in the song. There's no, it's always relieving itself. That doesn't sound right, I'm sorry, but it ends up being too simplistic sounding. Now you could still resolve that. Instead of it ending on the A sus4, you could do it where it's just an A. See, that's an A chord just in an inversion. But maybe you do that like this. You could go na 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 na. So it resolves after it's on the sus4. That's a little bit better, but if you just immediately resolve it, it's like, okay, it's sitting there for 4 count just on the resolved chord, and there's no tension, there's no movement to continue the song there. It just sits there. Listen. So keeping it on that sus4 gives it tension, and even if you still resolve it, that's okay, because you at least gave it some movement there. Now, you could also look at towards the end of the verse, maybe that's when you resolve it directly down to the A. You could do that, you can play around with it, find out what works, but don't be afraid of having that tension and not resolving it. That's a key part of worship music, or really any music, but don't be afraid of that tension. Okay, now let's go back to the 7th chord that was originally mentioned on the original chord chart that we had. We're like, that sounds awful. But we know that we figured out a G sus2 works. Now let's throw in that 7. Okay, that's a little too clustered together, sounds a little nasty. So let's instead start doing some inversions here. That's pretty interesting, because the 7, and I just jumped over a point I wanted to make. Where does it get that 7 from, and why is that chord chart saying G major 7? Well, it comes from here. It's part of the melody. So the chord chart's saying, hey, you might not necessarily play this 7th of the G chord, and I actually play it in the chord, but I'm telling you it's there because it's in the melody, so you can work with it harmonically if you want. So in this case, I'm saying, yeah, let's do that. Let's take this riff, or that chord right there that we have, let's invert it, and let's play around with adding that 7. And we're like, okay, well, if I'm playing the G in the bass, then I can drop it out here because it's already here. Okay, that's cool. So now it's still a D chord and an inversion. And then if I go to the next chord, well, I don't have to change anything up here because it's already a D chord from the first one. So I can do something a little different if I want. And what's cool here is now just 2 chords are all you need for those 3 chords. So, so that's cool because now it's something different. So you can look at that as maybe I play this later on in the song where I want to do something different to give it, since it's the same chords, maybe the same chord progression, I can do something different to give it a lift or to play something a little differently. Or thinking orchestrally, and you've got multiple musicians that are playing the same song, you can think of it as, okay, well, maybe the piano's playing, piano's playing that, and then maybe an organ or a keyboard player playing a string part is then playing. So you got the piano, you got the string part, putting them together, you've got that. So working together, you've got something a little bit more interesting. You could also think about, okay, maybe I'm going to use both hands to play the keyboard, and I want to, because I don't want to be banging down here with my left hand. I'll get to that in a minute. So maybe I'm going to do, I could do it as a 2-handed chord and get some more stuff happening there. That's kind of interesting. That's kind of combining those 2 different voicings that we got going on there. So that can be kind of cool, can be kind of fun. You could say, yeah, I could play that with one hand, but it's a little bit of a stretch. So if you could, especially if, a lot of times keyboard players, if they're playing with one hand or the other, they don't know what to do with the other hand. That's why so many keyboard players bang down here. So this is a way of giving both hands something to do. Okay, so that's interesting. That's another option that you can do there. So now that we've got some ideas on the verse, let's now move to the chorus, which if we look at the original chord chart that I have from my church, it has the chord progression of B minor to G, and again, I'm going to play it all in root position. B minor, G, D, A. And of course, we know we don't want to play it, in all root position because that sounds kind of goofy. So we can say, okay, well, what are some inversions we could do? B minor, okay, if we're going to G and we want to have good voice leading, all we got to do is move this note up to there. Now we've got a G and an inverted G. And then from here, we can go to a D. It's a little bit smoother there. And that sets us up for the A. So that's not bad. But can we still use that those sus chords that we did in the verse? Can we still use those here? Actually, yes, we can. So if we have our first chord of B minor, we could actually think of that as a B minor 7. Because if we have that as our chord, that's a B minor 7, but we're playing, you got a bass player playing the B, so you don't have to play it here, you could just leave it out. Now you're back to that D chord that we had in the verse, and the bass is now establishing that as a B minor 7. Now we can go to our G sus2 for that G chord. Next chord is going to be the D. Then the next chord we can have that A sus4 chord, just like we had in the verse. So now, cool, that sounds a lot more like the verse, or excuse me, the chorus of the song. And what's nice about it is it gives us a little melody. Because these two notes are the same in every chord. They're common tones. That is another secret to learning chord charts or figuring out chord charts, is there's always a lot of common tones from one chord to the next. Watch this. I'll play just these two notes for the whole chord progression of the chorus. Add in the notes that change. Take out the common tones and just do the notes that change. And that right there is the bulk of the song. That's the harmonic structure of the song right there, because that right there defines harmony-wise what you're doing, because everything else is just those common tones. So it gives you the ability to go, okay, I've got this line that I can feature, other instruments can feature it, and it gives you all that you need really for the song right there. Now obviously that's not saying that that's all you should play, but that helps to set you up in knowing, oh, okay, what can I do off of that little melody line there. And it just gives you a better understanding of the song and what's really happening, because a lot of times people try to play too much, and sometimes you just got to figure out what are the necessary notes that you need to play. And that's it right there. Everything else is the gravy. And if you look at that, what a simple keyboard part that is. So, and again, I mentioned earlier that you don't want to be playing bass notes with your left hand because you have a bass player. Assuming you have a bass player on your worship team, they're going to be playing down here, and there's nothing, I'm a bass player on my worship team. I'm actually not a keyboard player on my worship team, I'm a bass player. And there's nothing that bugs me more than a keyboard player that's banging octaves down here with his left hand. You don't need to be doing that. You should not be doing that. If you have a bass player, please do not do that, because you're stepping all over my part and you're limiting what you can do. You're basically saying, okay, I'm just overlapping what another musician's already doing, so you're wasting this left hand of being able to do anything else. Instead, what you need to be doing on this song is playing it with your left hand. Can't play with your left hand? Well, now's a good time to start learning. It's not hard to do, and it gives you so much more flexibility, because now, like on some of the recordings that I hear, there's this little melody line. Very simple, but you couldn't do that if you're playing like this, banging down here with your left hand. Oops, where am I at? There we go. So that's a very simplistic part, but I'm just showing you that when you play your chords with your left hand, it gives your right hand the ability then to do melodic things, to do other parts, to comp along with the melody that the singer is doing and doubling that, or really it just gives you so much more flexibility as a musician, and it keeps you away from stepping on the bass player's toes. So I just wanted to point that out for you. All right, so yeah, that's pretty much the meat and potatoes of this song. So let's kind of do an overview of what we've learned here. Basically, that even though it's a simple song, we've definitely learned that there's there's a lot of approaches and options on how we can, how we can interpret the song. But obviously listening to the original recording is a good way to do it, because when I looked at the chord chart and went, that's not right. Listen to the song and go, oh, I hear what they're doing there. They're doing the old sus chord deal there. And I know there's tons of versions out there, but I listened to a handful of them, and they all seem to be following that sus chord thing there. That's, listening to the original recording can also help give you a lot of clues as to what the chord chart, printed chord chart is trying to tell you. So the things that we learned here, just to kind of as a quick overview, use sus chords. Always look and see, okay, is this worship song trying to use sus chords? Because probably 50% or more of worship songs that I come across have sus chords like this, where they're just alternating between these sus chords and the major chord. So that's one main secret to interpreting chord charts for worship songs. The second is there's always a lot of common tones from one chord to the next. If you're completely jumping around or completely changing all the notes of each chord in the progression, you probably are doing something wrong. Probably. I'm not saying you are, but you probably are. The third thing that we learned, a secret to interpreting, deciphering chord charts, is the bass guitar is determining the chords. So that's the case with many worship songs, not all, but where the bass guitar is playing something different from what the keyboard player is playing in order to work together as a team to actually create what the chord is. The fourth thing we learned is that seventh chords can be used to imply harmony or to imply other things that are happening in the song. Like in this case, it was indicating a melody note that was being prominently featured in the melody, the vocal melody of the song, but it didn't necessarily have to be a note that was in the chord itself, unless you wanted to voice it that way, and I showed you how to do that. We also looked at doing some spread voicing, some two-handed voicings, where the chord is not just clustered up in one hand. You can kind of spread it out over an octave or more to get a richer sound. And we also, the sixth thing we went into and learned about was voice leading, like in the chorus. You can kind of hear these lines that are moving within the song and creating little melodies within the chord progression itself. And then, of course, we also explored inversions and how to move the chord around to find where the best place to play the chord is. All right, so if this video was helpful for you, I hope it was. Please subscribe to this channel, and I'm always trying to post information that'll be helpful for you.